5 years ago, in January of 2011, Tahrir Square, Cairo was the dateline. The fall of the Mubarak government was the story. Images of the revolution were watched around the world. Fast forward to 2016, and the message being issued by the Egyptian authorities and broadcast by the news media there is clear. Do not take to the streets. Last week, 5 people who started Facebook pages marking the anniversary of the revolution were arrested, accused of supporting the now banned Muslim Brotherhood. According to press freedom groups, the number of journalists in Egyptian jails is at an all-time high. As the NGO Human Rights Watch puts it, we're seeing a pattern of security agencies arresting people whose writings don't conform to official views. The bulk of the mainstream news media in Egypt did align itself with President Sisi against the Muslim Brotherhood. But now that that organization has been forced underground, there are some signs that the media's Sisi-mania is waning. Cracks are beginning to show, with both TV and print outlets rediscovering some of their critical faculties on matters of governance, corruption, and economic policy. Still, there are limits, and those who cross them risk much more than just their jobs. Our starting point this week, 5 years after the revolution that represented the high watermark of the Arab Spring, is Cairo. Anniversaries. The news media love them. Some governments have reason to fear them. And as January 25th approached, marking 5 years since the Mubarak regime was swamped in a sea of protests, the Sisi government put the word out, and the Egyptian media echoed it, that history would not be allowed to repeat itself.
اعمل حسابك نازل الشارع حاجة من اتنين يا تتسجن يا تتقتل.
In print, the headlines were equally ominous. Live bullets will be used against saboteurs on the 25th, and mosque orators demonstrating is haram.
The media, the pro-government media, continues to drum up that same sort of sentiment. And anyone who calls for, not even protest, but calls for the recognition of January 25th as an important date is represented as either a member of or a sympathizer of the banned Muslim Brotherhood, now described as a terrorist organization.
واللي هينفذوها بمناسبة الاحتفال ب 25 يناير المقبل.
There is all this, fear-mongering about how that day, if it's going to be observed with any kind of protest, is going to be a cause for a lot of instability and a lot of danger. El-Ahram newspaper, which is Egypt's flagship state newspaper, talking about all the security measures that the Interior Ministry is going to be taking in order to protect Egyptians.
January 25th has been fully appropriated by the state to the extent that now it might be a celebrated event as the first revolution to be followed by the June 30th revolution. I don't think there is a build-up of a narrative in the media to scare people of what might happen. Rather, a pacified, almost non-fear instilling policy of the day.
What some have called a clampdown on the media ahead of the anniversary is actually the continuation of the Sisi government's policies going back more than 2 years. The US-based Committee to Protect Journalists reports that at the end of 2015, Egypt was second only to China in the number of journalists jailed.
But in recent weeks, it's intensified. It started with a very recent high-profile case of Hossein Bahgat. He's a prominent journalist now with the independent news site Madamas. He was detained late last year by military intelligence for an in-depth article he wrote about the military trial of a number of officers in the army who had allegedly attempted to mount a coup.
The arrest in Hurghada of an Egyptian investigative journalist and researcher called Ismail Iskandarani. He had been speaking and writing on Egypt's security policy, especially in the Sinai, and he is now facing a slew of criminal charges.
And we see those examples happen across the board. Arrests from the online publication Masr al-Arabiya and elsewhere. So these have been across the board, happening sporadically in waves, but the intention here is to essentially instill the kind of fear that existed after 2013 in the hearts of most journalists.
So yes, there is a concerted campaign against freedom of expression in Egypt. But that campaign is not intimidating all journalists. There are many brave voices that remain in Egypt, and despite all the risks, they continue to call out what they see as wrong.
For the most part, those voices can be found in print or online. Like most governments with authoritarian approaches to journalism, Egypt's is far more tolerant of what is published in a newspaper than what is said in front of a camera and broadcast through the most influential medium that there is, television. TV journalists still have red lines they won't dare cross. Criticism of the president himself or the measures taken by the security apparatus. But they have started to take shots at the Sisi government's performance in other areas for reasons that may have less to do with ideology or politics than pure old-fashioned concerns over their own bottom lines.
It's now post just being anxious about protecting the state, it is now anxious about losing the viewers altogether. لميس الحديدي has been really on and off.
كان في صورة مثيرة جدا ازاي كده؟ ده انت وسط الجيش المصري. هو انت خايف من الجيش المصري؟
The discourse on Egyptian television is much more diversified than it seems from outside. It's much more because they can't afford it otherwise.
The passion for Sisi started to wane when people realized that no real change was being instigated, that corruption was just as widespread as it was beforehand, that brutality increased, that crackdowns became more vicious in order for the state to try and maintain a semblance of control over the population. And this is reflected somewhat in the mainstream media.
I don't believe there are any cracks between the alignment of Sisi and the mainstream media at all, even though you would get the occasional criticism of some kind of policy or the critique of a new law that was passed. There is no real fissure between them. The point is that Sisi and his regime are very aware of the power of the media. And they're also very aware of the fact there needs to be this semblance of freedom. There needs to be a little bit of space where people can perhaps criticize something. And it's part of their program.
And the authorities are proving to be hypersensitive to online platforms like Facebook, which was such a big part of the Arab Spring story, not just as a news distribution vehicle, but as an organizing tool. That spate of arrests of Egyptians who started Facebook pages to commemorate the January 25th anniversary is evidence that 5 years later, social media and the segment of the population that uses it most are both worth watching.
60% of the Egyptian population is under the age of 35, and they are much more engaged online than they are in participating politically. So the social media, it may not be a game changer, or it may not mobilize people into the streets the way it did in 2011, but nevertheless it is a critical part.
And that, in a nutshell, in a soundbite, is the Egyptian journalist's dilemma. How to mark a date that was a game changer without the critical part. Watch this space, and watch Egypt's media on January 25th as they watch their words. On the download now, our viewers weigh in on the state of the news media in Egypt.
I truly believe that the only chance for pluralism in Egypt will come from social media. There are many hashtag campaigns that were pretty successful in basically raising awareness on cases of activists, some fairly detained, and in some cases they even managed to get this activists and journalists released. And the second role that social media are playing in Egypt is monitoring the mainstream journalists and TV personalities, most of which are completely aligned in favor of the regime.
The majority of voices that have appeared in Egypt after the Arab Spring on social and on traditional media have really been silent. And crucially, the international audience that was very engaged with Egypt after the Arab Spring has now lost interest. Following the nationalistic fervor that happened around Sisi's election, people are now realizing that, poverty and corruption continue to be a problem. And this will feature in the media until these problems are solved.